So I had the privilege and the honor to serve in the Congress with Liz Holzman and Lou Frey and Tom Railsback, and it was wonderful. And I'd like to spend a few moments, because I listened carefully this morning to the splendid, precise presentation by Tom Railsback and Liz Holzman, who told you in detail what happened. And they were participants. They were in the Judiciary Committee. Now, other people were in leadership, but other people were just in Congress. We were the grunts. We were in the trenches. So what the heck was going on? Let's just give you my own experience. When I went to Harvard, I used to take courses with Archie Cox. And I used to take courses with a man named Jimmy St. Clair, who turns out to be the president's lawyer during the proceedings. But more importantly, in 1972, Ed Muskie, Senator Edmund Muskie, is running for president. And he's up in the great state of New Hampshire. And out in San Francisco in 1972, there's a funny Democratic punster and humorist named Dick Tuck. And he's almost eponymous as how funny he is. He's curly-haired, bright eyes. Nixon speaking in Chinatown. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese are out there waving flags. And Nixon's making a great speech. He's so happy. He turns to his buddies and said, "Jesus, that was great." And the other one turns to him, "Do you know what the flags that were flying by all those Chinese people, what that script said?" And he said, "No, what did it say?" He said, "Screw you, Dick." So Dick Tuck was playing all these kinds of games. Now let's turn to what kind of games were even played in 1972. To give you a progenitor, to give you an idea, back in 72, the Nixon people had taken a good look at Muskie, who had made a serious speech in 1968 when the president had won the first time, President Nixon, and he looked like a very, in fact, he had looked like a very serious contender. So Muskie was running in a campaign in New Hampshire for the New Hampshire primary against George McGovern and Scoop Jackson and a couple other people. The Nixon people, Kalmbach, Jeb Magruder, sent up somebody named Don Segretti, Segretti. Don Segretti. Segretti goes up there. In a few minutes, he doesn't do dirty tricks. Here's the first thing he does. He gets a letter out because he infiltrates Muskie's headquarters. He gets Muskie's mailing list and Muskie's letterheads. Sends a letter out to a bunch of papers saying, well, a bunch of people came up to Ed and said to him one day, "Senator Muskie, you don't seem to have many blacks up here in New England." And Muskie was reported to have said, "No, we don't have blacks up here, but we have problems with Canucks." Oh, my God. They put that in the Union Leader, the Manchester Union Leader, front page. And it just ripped Ed because that's like using an N-word for people of Franco-American descent. It was just an abomination. That was just the beginning. They'd send 500 pizzas, 5,000 roses, and they would charge the campaign. But then they went a little further. Again, they used the letterhead. And they sent out mailings really saying horrible things about Jackson and about George McGovern. Well, our friend Donald Segretti went to jail for several months, and so did two other people. I just want to give you an indication that even beginning in 72, they did these kinds of things. Now, I asked Liz Holtzman, would Nixon have already known about these kinds of endeavors? But whether he knew about them or not, it just shows an indication of the kind of people he had around him. And one thing that really struck me the other day, watching television, I see John Kerry in a naval lieutenant's uniform. And by the way, every time I see somebody in a lieutenant's uniform, I get very angry because I went to Naval Academy. I sailed in the fleet for years. But that damn Lou Frey outranks me. He's a captain in the Navy, and I'm only a lieutenant. And it always breaks my heart. And furthermore, he always reminds me. Anyway, so here's John Kerry, he's good looking in a uniform, and he's protesting the war in 71. And you get this film clip of Mr. Nixon talking to Colson. Colson hasn't gone to the church yet. He hasn't found the cross. But he says to Colson, "Who is this guy? This guy's mean. This guy's tough. He's leading the anti-war campaign." Colson said, "Well, he only spent a few months in Vietnam. He's an opportunist, and he's just going ahead." And Nixon said, "Gotta watch this guy." Colson then says, and I'll never forget it, should chill every American, "We're going to take this guy down." So that's a mindset. So when Liz Holtzman and Tom Railsback come along and tell you what's going to happen in 73, 74, this is the mindset. So what was I doing? Well, I'm an ordinary congressman in 72, 73, 74. We're running around. I'm trying to do a 200-mile fishing limit, a zone around our country, which we finally passed, which protects us from incredible invasion by foreigners putting their motherships in here and scooping up the whole ocean. We're worried about wage and price controls that Mr. Nixon had put in. We think about his secret plan to win the war, which was to bomb Cambodia. Mr. Nixon had really inherited a very cruel situation. President Kennedy began it. Johnson got us up to 565,000 troops. I remember in 72, December 72, for the fourth time I went to Vietnam together with Lou Frey. We went to outposts where people had 155 millimeter. And they were saying to us, "Get us the hell out of here. We don't want to be the last people in Vietnam." So Nixon was trying to wind the war down. But nevertheless, the hate that had grown against Johnson was transferred to President Nixon. So here was a president who had oil prices at $10 a barrel. Can you hear that, $10 a barrel? That was tremendous in those days. It's like $38 now. 9.2% unemployment. Inflation was up. The people were unhappy. Even though he had stopped conscription, nevertheless they were angry. So he had no reservoir of goodwill. So the minute something begins to bubble up and happen to him, he gets in massive troubles. And you can contrast there and compare that to Mr. Clinton. He didn't have that kind of circumstance when he got into his own personal problems. It was so vastly different. So we're watching this thing going on, and I read all the clippings and everything in the back in the paper, and I begin to see, as we get to 73 and 74, as you come back, someone spoke about this earlier, about the press. Every time you come in from Portland, Maine, and from Washington, come back to Portland, Maine, you're out campaigning, someone would say to you right away, "What about Watergate? We heard this today." I can't believe it, early in 74, Tip O'Neill comes up to Maine for a reception for me, 74, 75, 74, January or February, and Tip O'Neill says at that time, "I think within 3 or 4 months, the president will resign." So the stage was set, and things were going on that were really out of control. Now, we were taken down in rooms, unlike Liz and Tom, who were listening to everything in the Judiciary Committee. I think around July, we're taken down to rooms, given headphones, and we began to listen to real tapes about people saying, well, if these people that were caught, the plumbers, were not going to go to jail, and they need money, we can get $2 million. So we listened to several things that really startled us, plus a lot of expletives, as Dick Taylor would tell you, and much profanity. Not very pleasant things and kind of shocking. So the groundwork was kind of set. So when a good friend of mine was a governor from Maryland in 1970, his name was Spiro Agnew. And he never called himself Spiro. He called himself Ted Agnew. Once he got in to become vice president, I thought we were going to remain friends. But one time in 73, in the spring, I went down to the executive office building with some Maine people. One of my constituents had been killed in Vietnam. He was going to get a Medal of Honor to the family, posthumously. And I was down there. I'll never forget Spiro Agnew. Would not speak to me, ignored me completely, because in a few months, Spiro Agnew resigns because he was accused of tax evasion. Small-time political grifter who used to take $4,000 or $5,000 a month. I could not believe it. It's just unbelievable. So the framework of the times in the era was some of the worst I've ever seen. And yet, Lou Frey, Tom Railsback, myself, Liz, we're doing our daily work, and we're trying to keep on going. And everything that you do every day looked great. I remember one more thing, and I'll sit down because I want to hear the other people say some things about this. It was a foggy day. I was outside of Rockland, Maine, full of haddock, halibut, and clams. Outside, and then I stop, and we get out. There's a bunch of reporters there. They say, "Congressman, what have you got to say about Mr. Ford pardoning the president?" And my first instinct was, gosh, I'm glad we've got this thing all behind us. And I went to the next stop in Portland, Maine, and found out The other people didn't say that. Billy Cohen, who was on the committee with Liz and who's a Republican, said no, he should not have been pardoned. George Mitchell, the George Mitchell, who became Senate Majority Leader, was then running for governor that year, said no, he shouldn't have been pardoned. So by the end of the night, being a cautious and good man, I began to change my mind and began to mutter things about maybe we should look into it further. But I'll never forget how many people in Maine, Republicans, Democrats, Independent, were so damned angry at Mr. Nixon. Angry at him, I think Republicans, because he had let them down. And it was really a bizarre moment. After we come back, I'm in the floor of the House in September. It's a quiet afternoon, and I'm walking from one of the doors down the well, toward the well of the House, down one of the passageways. In front of me, there's this huge person, made even huger by the amounts of oaths she was uttering. She swore like a destroyer sailor, honest to God. And who was she swearing at? She was swearing at a cowering figure who had white hair. His name was Peter Rodino. Peter Rodino was the chairman of Judiciary. And she was screaming at him saying, USOBU, etc., why didn't you follow through with impeachment? Because as Liz told you, they passed out the articles of impeachment on a committee, but then they sent them to the House, they just approved them and did not follow on them. The House never voted on the articles of impeachment. And she's swearing at him. So I knew Bella, and I just stopped her, because that was my wont then, not having many brains. And I turned her around and said, Bella, you can't talk to the chairman like that. And by the time she accosted me, she scudded off like a little mouse in the fall. I'll never forget that as long as I live. So, in essence, my recollections were that how the nation, the nation had, I can think of three moments of the nation within my ken. George Washington putting us together with the Founding Fathers, unbelievable, under the odds that they made. The nation was split apart in 1860 by a civil war, how the nation never held together, and this was not a very pleasant time. The last thing was, Lou Frey and I are in late July, we're in the Oval Office. Lou worked on anti-drug programs. He had a huge task force on anti-drugs, and I was on committee with him, the Energy and Commerce Committee. And we were there, Lou, to do the signing of some bill. And there's Mr. Nixon. He'd been there before, he'd been there with Lyndon Johnson. And Mr. Nixon, I can tell you, was practically catatonic. He really was completely out of it. He just seemed so, he just muttered around, etc. And I'm saying to myself, my God, winding down the Vietnamese War, we're in the middle of the Cold War with the Russians, millions of problems going on throughout the country, and yet the president in such a state. And nevertheless, the resoluteness of the kind of young people we saw speaking today, the resoluteness of the country, and the strong ability in this Constitution, this belief that everything is going to work out, was really good. The one thing that bothered me this morning to hear is about the mistrust in government. I don't know if it's more like mistrust in government, more that perhaps we should just constantly question Mr. Nixon, Mr. Bush, Mr. Kerry, whoever chooses to lead us or tries to lead us. So I think those years, I want you to keep this in mind. The Congress was working. It did work. The whole system, appropriations bills, we had many, many arguments from Mr. Nixon, apart from Watergate. He used to impound funds. He used to say, you've appropriated money for these purposes. We're not going to spend that money. That drove the Congress crazy. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Out of Watergate, there were a bunch of reformers in the Congress. One guy was named John Bradibus, a Rhodes Scholar from Notre Dame, one of the smartest persons. What a smart ass he was, almost a god. He used to make me just nervous and feel condescended upon just by looking at me. For example, he said, what have you ever done? So anyway, John Bradibus and his reformers, Watergate comes along. What do? They double the staff on the Hill. Oh, we need more staff to deal with the White House. One, they put a budget act where Congress, for the first time, puts a framework in every year. You see them struggling right now. Let's say they're going to spend $800 billion for the whole year. And that budget doesn't allow the president to rescind or hold up the funds. Three, they put in campaign reform for the presidential election and the congressional election. Four, they say things like committees cannot meet in executive session. As Liz knows, you can't meet in secret meetings. We used to meet all the time with John Dean and write the drug bill. He was a representative from the White House. So they put all these reforms in. They changed the committee structure and made it more liberal. What happens? 1974. 20 years later, I think the year is 1994. The Democrats are so bloody corrupt, the Republicans sweep in, Newt Gingrich and company. They take these reforms that the Democrats had and make them much better, much forward. They really do. They change tenure of chairman. They make the budget agreement better. They make the rules for committees better. They really do. So what I'm trying to say is each succeeding generation builds on the next one. And that's the reasons why you should really understand the beauty and the symmetry of our government. And what it is really built for people like you to come forward each succeeding time, no matter what the crisis, and make it a lot better. Thank you.
Let me take a little different tack on it from a personal standpoint and the impact of Watergate. I was the fourth Republican elected to Congress in the state of Florida since 1870. In 1870. Dick and I were contemporaries. This was a 3 or 4 to 1 Democrat district. There were 2.5 million more Democrats in the state than Republican. And there weren't many Republicans in the South at the time. It was a solid South for the Democrats. We had taken a strategy that we hoped to work with young people. Somebody asked a question, what could you do? And we got a lot of young people to work on the campaigns. And our goal was eventually to take over control of the House of Representatives, which was sort of a pipe dream, but it was a good pipe dream. And when President Nixon barely won in '68, and most people forget how close the election was, George Wallace was leading Florida about in August of '68, and Humphrey was coming on. I think the polls show 2 or 3 more days nationally, and Humphrey might have won. But we did win that, and then the president went on and did a number of incredibly good things. Times were tough. We did actually have wage price controls, but he did a lot of things people didn't think he would do, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and helping in our oceans, preventing pollution in our oceans, and starting cancer research. So we were building up some momentum. And the Democrats in that time nominated someone who I have a lot of personal respect for. As a matter of fact, we just honored 3 weeks ago in Washington, George McGovern. But he had demonized or energized the liberal side of the Democrat Party and had swept into office. He was a very honest, decent liberal who never changed, was against the war, and he had sort of taken the left side of the Democrat Party. And it didn't sell well nationally at that time. Because of my age and that, and because of the fact that Marcia with 5 kids basically lived at home, so I commuted, a lot of younger members of Congress lived together or shared apartments and this kind of thing. And in those days, it didn't make any difference what the party was. They were just friends. And it so happened a lot of the people I knew were the Young Democrats from mostly the South and the Midwest. We had been working with them, and a guy named Joe Wagner, Peter, who you remember, and had convinced about 30 of them or more to join the Republican Party in 1974. And that, with our numbers we had, would have given us control of the Congress since the first time since, I think, 56 or sometime in there, back in there. And they were all willing to go and so forth, and then something called Watergate came along. And it was obvious that the Republican Party was going to take a heck of a beating. We did take a heck of a beating. 73 new members of the House were elected in '74. We went as Republicans from 190-something to 140-something. I felt like I joined Custer's 7th Cavalry right before the Little Bighorn. My close friend Walter Flowers, who was one of the ones going to change when this was going on, we were talking about it, and he called me. He said, "Kid," "I love you." He said, "I love you like a brother." He said, "But your ship done sunk, and I ain't going down with it." And he didn't. And the impact of Watergate politically continues to this day. The election reforms, the Federal Election Commission, the McCain-Feingold bill, many of those things you see came out of the Watergate. I'm not so sure it would have happened without the Watergate. I'm not so sure if we were in control as a Republican Party we would have done some of those things. So I'm certainly not happy about Watergate, but on the other hand, positive things came out of Watergate. The thing that I am most disappointed that came out of Watergate is not a skepticism about government, because there should be. Our country was formed on a skepticism of government. That's why we've got the checks and balances. We don't want any one person controlling us, and I think that's very healthy. But a cynicism about government. I learned, I guess, the hard way that we have an incredible system of government. I also learned the hard way that the people don't always live up to the system, unfortunately. But our system is, when you look at it, and the founders of this country that put our Constitution together, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they did something that is as meaningful today as it was 200 and some years ago, and works in times of great stress, and works in times when you're getting bombarded from every side, and you truly get up in the morning, and you just don't know if you can get through the day. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if there are going to be troops in the streets. You know, you just truly wonder if our country can hang together. And you had people like Liz and Tom sitting on that committee with incredible pressure on them because, as Elizabeth said, and her family are immigrants. Here she is sitting in judgment on the most powerful person in the world. There's probably no other country than America where you could drive the most powerful person in the world out without troops in the streets, with a combination of reporters and members of Congress and the public working together. And so, while Watergate is in some ways the worst thing I've ever been through, you know, like the book, The Worst of All Days, Best of All Days, in some ways it is the best thing I ever survived because it proved to me, and I think to you, it's just as important to each of you out there today, that we do have a country that really does have a rule of law. And while there's still racial bias, while there's still a glass ceiling, while we haven't solved all the problems, we're trying. And I can tell you, in my opinion, that we're a lot better off today than we were when President Nixon left office, not just because he left office, but I think we made strides as a country, and Watergate is part of the reason we made those strides. Tom?
The aftermath of Watergate for me and for the party nationally and in Illinois, where I'm from, was there was a 15% drop in the Republican turnout in that election year. The Democrats, as Lou said, picked up like 70 seats. What that did, that meant in the congressional basketball game, we had a lot of trouble. In the congressional baseball game, we had Vinegar Ben Mizell pitching for us. And frankly, Bob Michael had won 11 straight ball games. And the Democrats all of a sudden got tough. More seriously, Gerald Ford, who pardoned President Nixon, and I happen to think did the right thing by putting an end to our national disaster. I think it probably cost Jerry Ford the next presidential election. There were all kinds of reforms. The young Democrats wanted lobbying reform. And frankly, up until that time, there was not a great deal of disclosure remember those of you that are old enough, we had the problem with the milk producers giving money kind of on the sideline. Anyway, lobbying reform was tough to get through, and I was involved trying to get it through. Campaign finance reform that Lou has alluded to, there were changes and more disclosure, not as much as they're working for now. But I agree with Lou that there should be a positive outlook that resulted from that ordeal for a lot of us, and so I kind of second and hope that our young people work for, continue to work for change to make us even better. Thank you.
Now, I was a graduate of Valencia for some of the students that are here, and also a graduate of this institution. And at the age of 26 was one of the youngest members of the House elected and served 8 years. And Lou, of course, was at 32, one of the youngest members of Congress to be elected. And so if you look at the both of us, you can see what politics does to you. And so you might want to dissuade your involvement. But I volunteered for the Marine Corps and spent a tour in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive and came back and got involved in campus politics because I frankly had no interest in going to college, but I had the GI Bill, which was one of the best things to ever happen. Let me just parenthetically say that what I'm going to try to do is reflect on some of the things that came out of Watergate in later years, and then particularly at the state level and how it might apply today. So that would be my charge today. I will say, though, Congressman Railsback, there are two good things you pointed out. If you were here to stand in for Mr. Vanderjack, who I see in Washington from time to time, I will not tell him that you said, I'm here to stand in for Guy Vanderjack, so I will be very brief. Number one, he's never been brief, and number two, but I think it would be insulted after 20-some years in the Congress that you didn't have that much to say on his behalf, but I'll pass it along. And the other good observations, even though you might have played softball and baseball or whatever with the Congressman, you never had to play golf with Gerald Ford, so you're in still relatively good health, so that's a good thing, too. But after coming back from Vietnam and getting involved in campus politics, I went through a process of trying to decide which party I was going to belong to. And again, this is really just beginning the discussions about, it was the re-election, and it was the election in '68. The campaign, I believe, was in Miami, Lou. That was when all the campaigns were scripted. In fact, they had your speeches, you had to follow along, and they had the applause line. So everything was pretty well orchestrated in those days. I finished school at UCF, and because I had been so involved in politics, the first job I had, well, let me back up. When I was involved in politics, I started several young Democratic clubs, one at Valencia, Seminole, one at Rollins, one at FTU at the time, which shows you how many years ago I attended here. So I became very involved politically and traveling to Tallahassee, as I mentioned to the earlier group, and lobbying for the 18-year-old vote and really researching and trying to stay somewhat abreast of political issues and involving myself in the process. And when I finished FTU, and now UCF, my first job I went to work for Hubert Humphrey. I was flown down to Miami to meet with Senator Humphrey and Muriel, his wife, and which was just an awesome opportunity to have had the chance to work with the former vice president and a really a star in the United States Senate, a real icon in American politics. So I had the opportunity to travel with the senator some. So I became even more involved in politics and looking at the national level. Years passed, I get elected to the legislature, and we start talking about legislation like the Sunshine Law. The Sunshine Law is a law that is now on the books in the states that requires that all public meetings be open to the public. It wasn't always that way. In fact, on the contrary, a lot of meetings would take place in the hallways or over pizza and beer, and most of the decisions that impacted your life, from budget to substantive policy, oftentimes were made outside of the public view, ergo, outside any participation from the public itself. The other requirement of that Sunshine Law, which I think is part of the ramifications of the Watergate era, is the requirement that no two elected officials on the same body can correspond with each other verbally on any issue that might become before them. Your county commission, for instance, here locally, if there's an issue that's going to be before the county commission on which they're going to cast a vote, they happen to be walking on Orange Avenue one day, passing each other going to and from lunch, and they can't say, "Oh, Bill, by the way, there's an issue coming up at the next committee meeting or the next commission meeting." If they do that, they violate the Sunshine Law, which is a very stringent law in Florida. So, that, again, it was because on the heels of Watergate, it was an effort by elected officials at the federal and the state level, and in some cases locally, to try to be able to open the process up, basically shed some sunshine on the process and invite the public's intense scrutiny of what was happening. And that was really part of allowing the public to be more vigilant, about the system of government that we have. So the Sunshine Law worked to that effect. The other thing that I did, the late Senator Childs and others were heavily involved in that, but I'll refresh the memory of those who were around then. Governor Rubin Askew at the time actually could not get the legislature to adopt this and went and resorted to a constitutional amendment through the referendum process. The Sunshine Law on disclosure matters had to be adopted by the public because the vested interest in the political process were not quite ready to have the public viewing every decision they made, particularly if it were outside the sunshine. In 1975, as a freshman, 26 years old, I decided lobbyists were running wild in Tallahassee and should be at least required to should at least be required to register publicly and say who their clients are, and also financially disclose how much they were being paid, who they were taking to lunch. Again, this is all public information that were the public to have it, the public can make their own judgments as to who is trying to influence public policy. And that was always the thesis. The public has the right to know every decision being made and who's influencing that decision in the process, because ultimately it impacts the general population. Well, I filed this bill. I thought it was going to be a neat thing to do. In fact, I had gotten the Archibald Cox had presented me with a Common Cause Award. I just really thought this was the nicest thing to do for the public, and all hell broke loose in Tallahassee. What was this young upstart 26-year-old filing this radical socialist piece of legislation to require lobbyists to register and disclose who they're taking to lunch? By God, when does the public deserve to know what's going on in the halls of Tallahassee? So it was a very difficult piece of legislation. And what happened is they had a House rule. And I anticipated at the press conference they were going to say, we don't need a piece of legislation. We don't need to burden the process. We already have a House rule that requires such. So what I did at the press conference is I read the list of every lobbyist who had failed to register under the House rule, obviously making the House rule completely insignificant and inconsequential to the process. We passed it because, again, there were enough people elected in 74 and 75. In fact, I was the first post-Watergate election. So you had a lot of young people coming into government. In fact, I would suggest, Lou, if you might recall this, never having been in office was your biggest qualifier to run for office post-Watergate, in all seriousness, because they figured you had not been involved in the process, you had not become a part of the institutional process, thus you had not been tainted yet. So there were a lot of people elected in 1974 across the country, in the legislature and in the Congress, that really became more reform-minded in both parties. So we had the financial disclosure bill. It was passed. It is law in the state of Florida, requiring lobbyists to register and disclose. So you now can go online and know exactly who spent what amount of money on whom, and not to be overly judgmental or suggest that there's some nexus, but at least the public has the right to know. You can draw your own conclusions. I would suggest to you that just because someone took someone to lunch or someone made a contribution, ergo, that doesn't mean they're going to vote that way at all. But again, the thesis is, does the public have the right to know everything that is being done to try to influence legislation? And I would say, too, in conclusion and observation, there are two things. There are many to talk about, but in conclusion I might mention two. The third-party influence of elections, too. Even though we've got McCain-Feingold legislation, even though it's been upheld by the court, there are some who really oppose the restrictions under the First Amendment rights of the Constitution for free speech. Some people oppose the cutoff of third-party expenditures 30 days before the election, again under First Amendment protections. But what I fear, and even though on both sides there are Democratic organizations or Democratic-leaning organizations that have filed third-party organizations now, 527s or 529s? 527s, I had it right. The 527s, even though they're Democratic-oriented groups, have filed, and they're raising millions of dollars to spend against the president. And likewise, if the challenge if they win the challenge to continue doing that, then I would suggest to you on the other side, you're going to see a great number of 527 organizations come together, spend literally, aggregately, hundreds of millions of dollars to try to influence the election. So we get around, essentially, McCain-Feingold, because now what you have, again, we go back to the time that there are third-party organizations collecting, literally, aggregately, hundreds of millions of dollars, which they will spend on both sides of this election to influence the outcome of the selection of our president. So that goes back in the shadows, no longer in the sunshine, because we don't know if an organization comes up and says, we are the Committee for the Preservation of Everything Good in America, period, and you write a check to them worth, $20 million or aggregately $20 million, they can influence the outcome of the election of president. But you do not know. You do not know, as the owner of this process and of this institution called government, you do not know who is spending the money to influence your decisions. So that is one of the real difficult things which I think we're still attending to. It invites situations like Watergate. And the last thing I'll say, and of course we'll all be glad to take questions or comments later, is that my observation, having come back from Vietnam, getting involved in politics, getting involved in government, and coming through the post-Watergate reform era, the question that begs itself is whether or not it can happen again. And in my contention is, it is happening. Whether or not you agree with the politics of it, in my opinion, the public has the right to know who the Vice President met with when they drafted the energy policy of this country. You have a right to know. It's not necessarily nefarious that he met with these people, but the public has the right to know. Condoleezza Rice, at this point, not appearing before the 911 Commission, in my opinion, is a very difficult political decision, and somebody gave some very, very bad advice, because in the end, the one thing I think we learned from Watergate, and Lou and I discussed this the other day, is that the process has changed. It is a much more open process. The public is invited at every turn to be involved in the process, whether it's by a political party or an independent party or an independent expenditure committee or emailing or webbing or however you want to do it, you're involved to be in the process. And I think the one thing we have learned in closing is that because of Watergate, anybody, including President Clinton and with Whitewater, would have been better served had they just put everything on the front lawn of the White House and said, here's the information, this is the truth of what happened. Because of Watergate, because of the influence of the press, and because of the influence of individual members of the public, in the end, you're going to have to do it anyway. And there's an old saying in politics, if you're getting run out of town, get in front of the crowd so it looks like you're leading a parade.
My question is, I'm a political science major in Daytona, and what I've really uncovered through a research paper about the Campaign Finance Act of 1974 has really been overwhelming for me to discover. And so my question is, since the Republican Party leads in the funds and the PAC money, the soft money, 2-to-1, and since McCain-Feingold has been passed, do you foresee something further going on with the Congress to make the playing field even with this campaign finance situation?
Yeah, I think they're going to do some things. I think my belief is that some First Amendment questions are going to surface and some parts are going to be held unconstitutional. There's obviously gaping holes in the bill today with these groups that have been formed, and we've made a start at it, but there's a way to go. Just so you know, I have been involved in a group for, 20 years that has been against soft money. I would much rather see them raise the so-called hard money that you put in and report it. They've raised it from $2,000 to $4,000, but I have no problem if they raise it more. And no corporation gifts, let them put hard money in. and report that, and I just soon see no soft money in either side, because that's where I think the corruption is, in both sides of the aisle, and I don't think it's a healthy thing for our system. There is the other side of that, though, First Amendment question, which you ought to think about before you make a decision. Money is a form of communications or talk, and why can't I, if I'm Jack Eckert or somebody, go out and put a lot of money into something that I believe in? Why should I be restricted because I maybe worked harder than you and raised some more money than you? So it's again, there's two sides to the question. I just happen to think we'd be better as a country to do away with soft money.
Tom?
Yeah, I agree with what Lou has said. I think a lot of Republicans are concerned about some of the spending almost non-identified. I think you're going to find bipartisan support. Like, well, a lot of Republicans are worried about a guy like, what's his name?
George Soros.
Yeah, George Soros. Spending $20 million, greatly exceeding the limit. And I'm sure there are Republicans doing, that can do the same thing. So let's hope so. I think there'll be a bipartisan effort.
Dick?
I hope.
Let me give you first of all, for those who might not pay a lot of attention to campaign finance, and correct me if I'm wrong, but hard money is a personal contribution. You write a personal check. Soft money being money from a political action committee or from a corporation or from a union, some other organization. That is the distinction there. Let me give one example. Rick Keller, with whom I was with Friday, we're very civil acquaintances, even though we're from different parties. But keep in mind, in his campaign, he ran against, there was a three-way race, and actually a three-way primary, then a general election. He won the primary, and then he faced former county commissioner, former county chairman Linda Chapin, who was very popular. And in the last part of the campaign, a committee called the Committee for Economic Growth spent $300,000 on behalf of his campaign. And what that suggests is, who are these people, and what is their agenda, and why are they trying to influence, albeit select, who is going to represent us down here in Orlando? Now, that's just one example. There are groups on both sides, but I would suggest to you that to spend $300,000 of independent expenditures to influence the selection of your congressman or your congresswoman is inappropriate. And I would also suggest that they didn't do it because they like Mickey Mouse. And they didn't do it necessarily because they've ever been to Central Florida. They did it because they want to influence a vote in the congressional process. And unless you're absolutely semi-comatose, if someone gives you $300,000 and they have an issue before your committee, you probably are going to give it real serious consideration. So that's the process, and that's an anecdote, but it's replayed over and over again by both parties, independent expenditures. And again, McCain and Feingold has a very good intent. Some of the First Amendment issues are going to still be out there, and I think challenged. But what it's trying to do, and if that doesn't work, we've got to find another way to do it, is to open it up. And one way, as a final note, is opening this up. You today can go on your computer to Tallahassee, or you can go to Federal Elections Commission, and you can download every expenditure, every contribution to every elected official. Again, the public has a duty, too, to be vigilant. Because if you believe that the institutional government is owned by you, but you fail to participate in it, then don't complain. Because you have access to tremendous information, and you have the ability to influence those decisions if you will make the mark to do so, or make the effort to do so. So in the end, while Congress can keep trying to pass laws and withstand the constitutional muster of those laws, in the end, the final day, it really depends on the absolute influence of the public on those elected officials as to whether or not you're going to get the kind of government you want. Somebody said you get the kind of government you deserve. So you have to be very vigilant about government. In fact, I would suggest to you, and maybe Lou and I would certainly agree on this, and I think as a Democrat, I don't trust government. I don't think as a Republican, Lou trusts government, because government is an institution. It's an apparatus. The people you put in there, the process by which you put people in to run the government, is the real question there. So you should never innately trust something Thomas Jefferson wrote a pamphlet called Persona Ficta versus the Natural Person. You know, the corporate entity versus the natural person. The natural person has primacy in a democracy. But if you're not there, not playing in this game, then in the end, what you lose, you know, you have to assume the responsibility for it.